Okay, actually, it says in the program that I'm talking about eating the way we farm and farming the way we eat. I've just changed the title to make it a little sexier, Why Farming is Making Us Fat. So it's kind of a headline grabbing thing. I'm not really talking that much about obesity, and I'm certainly not talking about farming itself making us fat. But hopefully you'll see throughout the course of my talk, I'm trying to illustrate how Americans are eating today, how they have eaten historically, how we have farmed and how that has changed, and how these two things are really linked together, and how we cannot solve the problems with our food system until we solve the problems with our farming system. And we must address the problems in our farming system in order to address the health problems that are related to food and the problems in our food system. So the first thing is the American diet. And what are sort of the signs today? A lot of this has already been alluded to today, but there are many indicators that the way most Americans are eating today is very unhealthy. Probably the leading indicator is the fact that 2/3 of Americans are now overweight. They're either overweight or obese. Obesity is the highest category of overweight. And children, the rate of obesity in the last 30 years has actually tripled. So these are alarming statistics about our health and related to the way we eat. We also have 1/3 of our population having hypertension, which is closely related to diet. 42% of deaths in the United States annually now are from heart disease, which is very closely diet related. Compare that to the beginning of the 20th century when only 8% of Americans died annually from heart disease. It's a dramatic increase. And finally, cancer, which is the second leading cause of death is increasingly believed to be diet related as well. So that's the first slide. Diet related diseases are dramatically up. But at the same time, interestingly, our food spending is way down. So in the 1930s, most Americans spent about 25% of their income on their food. By about 1950, that had gone all the way up to 31%. Today, it's about 9%. So we're eating more, we're getting a lot more sick from our food, but we're spending much less on our food. Our food waste is also very high. It's kind of at epidemic proportions. Almost half of the food that's planted in the United States is never consumed. And by weight, food is the leading component of American garbage. Our calories are way up. And this is probably one of the most dramatic figures in my mind about the food situation and the diet situation in the United States. On average, Americans are now eating 523 calories more per day per person than they were just 30 years ago. The majority of those calories are coming not in meals, but from snacks. And most Americans, on average, about 34% of their calories are coming from fast food. Now, interestingly, a lot of what I'm going to present today is designed to make you rethink some of your assumptions about what the problems actually are in the food system. And this, to me, is one of the most important figures. Our grain consumption is dramatically up in the United States. So in the last 30 years, the average American is now eating 48% more grains than they were just 30 years ago. Added sweeteners, and these two things are related and equally important, are also dramatically up. We are now consuming on average about 60% more calories from sweeteners than we were at the beginning of the 20th century. And interestingly, in the last few decades, beet and cane sugar consumption have actually gone down a little bit, but high fructose corn syrup consumption has gone up by over 10,000%. We're eating far too little fruit and vegetable. We kind of hear this all the time, we kind of know this, but this is definitely part of the problem of the healthfulness that the population has or doesn't have due to our diet. Vegetables, according to USDA recommendations, we're only eating about half the vegetables we should per day. And the data that shows that we're eating half, actually about 1/3 of the figure is made up from French fries, potato chips, and iceberg lettuce. 3 foods that maybe shouldn't even be counted at all. And that figure, and our veg consumption is about, our fruit consumption is less than half of USDA recommended daily consumption. Our poultry and cheese consumption are way up. We're eating about 5 times more poultry or chicken than we did at the beginning of the 20th century. We're eating about 4 times more annually turkey than we did, and we're eating about 8 times more cheese than we did. However, and this is probably the thing that startles most people when they see this presentation, is that other animal products are way down. So we have kind of a general assumption that those figures have gone up like this. That's not true. When you look at the figures like per species, it's very clear. So specifically, our annual beef consumption compared to about a century ago is about 11 pounds less per person per year. Our annual veal consumption, most people don't eat very much veal at all, but it's now 7 pounds less per person per year than it was about a century ago. Lamb consumption is down about 5 pounds per person. Pork consumption is down about 14 pounds per person per year. And we're eating about 41 fewer eggs per person per year than we did 100 years ago. That is stuff that most people are very surprised to hear. And specifically red meat. Red meat is generally down, has been generally down throughout the course of the 20th century, but especially in the last 3 decades, beef consumption alone has been down by 22% in the last 3 decades. And corresponding with that, we are eating a lot less saturated fat and animal fats. Again, most people think it's the opposite, but that's what the data shows very clearly. All the official government data shows this. Throughout the course of the 20th century, our saturated fat consumption has gone down by about 21%, and and specifically some of the main sources of animal fat, like lard consumption in the last 3 years has gone down by almost 50%. People really don't cook with lard very much anymore. Butter has gone down 15%. Whole milk is down 73%. So people are just drinking a lot, drinking and eating and baking with animal fats a lot less. However, vegetable fats are way up. So our total consumption of added fats throughout the course of the 20th century has doubled, and our consumption of vegetable fats, vegetable oil specifically, in the last 30 years has gone up by 400%. This is a chart that just shows some of the stuff I was just talking about with respect to the fats. You see the top line shows the total amount of fat that we're consuming. The second line shows vegetable fats going way up, and it shows animal fats going steadily down. Breastfeeding was mentioned earlier today. I'm just going to touch on it briefly. It's incredibly important for good health, not just for infants, but for adults, that they were breastfed. And statistics in the United States show that only by 6 months of age, only about 20% of children are breastfed. There's universal recommendation now that they should be breastfed for about a year. And there's increasing data showing that formula is linked not only to a variety of infant health problems, but also to obesity and heart disease as adults. So that has long-term implications. Now, what about agriculture and how we're raising our food today? We know increasingly that a lot of the environmental problems in the world are due to the way agriculture is being practiced. Specifically, or historically rather, agriculture was not a major polluter. Farms were diverse. That means they had lots of different kinds of crops and animals that they raised, and they were usually in smaller numbers and in smaller land areas as far as crops that were raised, and the farms were dispersed. This is a typical farm that was raising pigs about 50, 60 years ago. The animals would have been based on grass. They would have been in fairly low numbers, and they would have been spread around the countryside like this. In fact, large percentages of farms in the United States always had a couple of cows, they had a couple of pigs, they had a small flock of chickens, rather than being in large concentrated herds and flocks as they are today. And this is a typical early 20th century farm that was raising poultry. The animals are based on grass, they're outdoors, they're in low density flocks and herds. However, around 1950, when agriculture began to be more and more industrialized, there was a recognition that the new form of agriculture was really a distinct entity, this concentrated industrialized form. And when the Clean Water Act was adopted in 1970, by the time that happened, Senator Robert Dole himself, who later on ran for president, but was a big agricultural proponent, he was an advocate of having a separate legal distinction within the Clean Water Act for industrialized agriculture because of its potential for massive pollution, which historically farms did not have. Water pollution, the US EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, now says that agriculture is the #1 source of water pollution in the United States. 60% of impaired river miles and over half of polluted lake acreage are directly attributed to farm pollution. The agricultural runoff, as was mentioned earlier, is today the primary cause of a dead zone the size of the state of New Jersey in the Gulf of Mexico. Soil erosion is something that doesn't get nearly, it's not as sexy as climate change and other things, it doesn't get nearly as much press, but it could be the single most important environmental problem we're facing as a human species. We are now eroding the soil due to modern agricultural practices at a rate 30 times the rate of regeneration. So we are basically jeopardizing our ability to feed ourselves as a human population in the future. Air pollution and global warming, agriculture is now a major contributor to both. I'm just going to touch on genetically modified organisms. They've been mentioned a couple of times today already. Between 85 and 95% of the corn, canola, sugar beets, and soy in the United States today, all four of those crops, between 85 and 95% are genetically modified now. And no one knows the long-term health or environmental implications of that. The changes, to get a little more specific about how have we changed agriculture and why has it changed, we're certainly, everybody knows, we have larger farms today. So on average, farms are 3 times the size they were historically. And actually that figure is a little bit misleading because the average doesn't show how dramatically large some farms now are and how historically how small most farms were. But on average, 3 times the size. There are far fewer farms and fewer farmers. So to illustrate that, in 1790, about 90% of Americans were involved in farming. Today, fewer than 1% claim farming as their full-time profession. And among the farms that do exist, 60% of them produce less than $10,000 worth of goods every year. So they're really very much part-time or hobby farmers. So we have far, far fewer farmers and fewer farms. We have so many people that have left the countryside and are living in cities, urban areas, that we only have 17% of our population living in rural America. There's dramatically falling farm income, which is certainly part of the reason we have seen the exodus from farms. On average, an American farmer now gets 11 cents of every dollar, which is one of the reasons farmers' markets are so great, as we heard about before, because the farmer gets a bigger piece of that than is typical. Farm people have been replaced over the 20th century by increasingly by fossil fuels, and by fossil fuels I mean coal, oil, and natural gas. And that's done in 2 ways, both directly through mechanization. That's about 60% of the energy usage on farms is from mechanized equipment and vehicles. And the other way that fossil fuels are spent on farms is, and most people are less aware of this way, and that is via chemicals, agricultural chemicals. So that includes fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides. Now the majority of that, all of those things are produced very heavily using fossil fuels, and so it makes the food system more and more dependent on fossil fuels than it would be even if you got rid of all the vehicles and all the automated equipment, you still have a lot of fossil fuels required. Fertilizers are the bulk of it. The other things, sort of by pound basis, are a lot less. And the interesting thing about fertilizer use is that fertilizers were first developed in 1830 in Germany, but were barely used for about 100 years. And after World War II, there were idle munitions plants. Those were converted to nitrogen fertilizer producing plants, and all of a sudden fertilizer use in the United States doubled, and it went dramatically up in the decades that followed it. So we're at very high levels today. And finally, the last thing that has really replaced people on farms is pharmaceuticals. It really replaces the human labor and the human care that was historically given to animals to put them in confinement and to give them a lot of drugs. And last year, the FDA itself, the Federal the Food and Drug Administration, the federal government agency, stated that 80% of all antibiotics in the United States every year are given to animals and 90% of that are to animals that are not even sick. They're being given drugs to enable them to be in crowded conditions and to speed their growth. I'm just going to show a couple of pictures of what these modern systems look like. This is a hog waste disposal system in North Carolina, just spraying liquefied hog manure onto a frozen field. This is a typical hog operation. This is the ventilation and feeding system, which is all automated. And there would be about 30,000 hogs in an operation like that. This is the outside of a, and don't worry, we'll go inside in a moment. This is the outside of a typical egg operation. There are about 1 million hens inside of that operation. This is inside. These are the battery cages. Now, those of you who follow these things know that Proposition 2 was passed in California a couple of years ago. So these will become illegal in the state of California, thankfully. But this is still the dominant way of raising egg-laying hens in the United States. And here's another picture of battery-caged hens that are egg layers. This is a typical chicken operation. Again, there will be about 100,000 chickens at a place like this. Typical turkey operation would have around 30,000 and would always be continually confined. California is the #1 dairy state in the United States. This is what pretty much all the dairies look like now, with just a few exceptions. And a typical total confinement dairy would have around 10,000 cows. And this is another shot of those kinds of operations. The pig operations, again, the animals are continually confined. They're on graded or slotted floors that are metal or wood or cement, and their waste goes underneath. They stand above their waste 24 hours a day and breathe those fumes. Here they are as recently weaned pigs. Here are again, these are illegal, or they will be illegal in the state of California. This is a gestation crate where the vast majority of sows in the United States spend most of their lives during their pregnancies. And this is a shot of a gestation crate operation, a view looking down on one. And this is where they go just before they give birth to a slightly larger crate, and that's a farrowing crate. So the only way that the mother sow and the piglets can interact is through those metal bars. Here's another picture of a farrowing crate. Okay, thank God, right? It's painful to look at those pictures, right? But this is how the vast majority of the animal products in the United States are produced today. Now, despite the incredibly dismal situation, and you would think, well, we must be doing this to feed all the people and to produce all the food that we need. That must be why we're doing it. So you'd think we'd have a lot more animals that we're raising in the United States today. Well, that is actually not correct. Animal numbers in general are about the same, or they are down from historical levels, other than some exceptions, which I'll talk about in a moment. So beef cattle, over the course of the 20th century, are actually slightly up. They're up about 28%. They're down dramatically over the last few decades. But there's been kind of a steady climb. But it's not a huge increase. It's 28% from a century ago. Pig numbers, pork, exactly the same number of pigs in the United States today that there were 100 years ago. Other animals, dramatically down. So dairy cow numbers are down by about 75%. Sheep numbers are down by about 85%. And work animals on farms, like mules, oxen, and horses that do work, are down by 90%. So the total number of animals in the United States that are involved in farming is far less than people generally believe. Now, the exceptions to that are poultry. So if you remember when I talked about per capita consumption, that's also reflected in farm numbers. And we do a lot of exporting of poultry. So the total numbers of chickens that are slaughtered every year for food now is about 250 times greater than it was 100 years ago. And for turkeys, it's about 15 times as much. So another characteristic of modern agriculture is that it's very segmented and it's very monoculture now. So rather than farms that are diverse and are where the animals and the plants are working together, farms are very specialized now and the animals are separated from the land. We've seen the pictures of that, and in terms of monoculture, the average farm at the beginning of the 20th century had about 5 crops and animals, 5 different types of things that they were doing. The average farm today has just 1. Now, I think this is a really pivotal point Again, talking about what people assume is happening with agriculture and why. Most people assume we are raising so much, we are doing factory farming and industrial production because we need to produce so much more food today. Interestingly, this quote from some agricultural economists talks about the fact that overproduction has actually historically been the largest problem for American agriculture. It says, except in wartime, there have been too many resources producing too much product, excess production capacity on American farms since 1930. This is the basic problem of the commercial farm sector. And this graph just quickly shows, this was alluded to earlier as well, it shows the fact that we are subsidizing these kinds of foods and we're recommending in USDA guidelines that people eat these kinds of foods. So there's a complete mismatch between the subsidies and the nutrition guidelines. So this is how I've kind of summarized my whole presentation to this point in this little formula. Agricultural subsidies of various types, which would include non-enforcement environmental laws, plus industrial methods equals overproduction, plus underemployment, which equals cheap food. And cheap food equals overeating, waste, and pollution. So this is my way of kind of summarizing the whole system right now as we are today. What do we do to solve this? So I argue we really just need to return some common sense to the way we eat and to the way we farm. There are things that the government must do. First of all, our farm policy should be focused on employing people on farms rather than simply focusing on production. We don't need more. We've just seen the overproduction issue. We also must consider nutrition. I showed the mismatch between the subsidies and the USDA guidelines about how we eat. Here's a quote from the UN Special Rapporteur on Right to Food, who looks at this question globally, and he argues the world must urgently decouple agriculture from oil, and the world's farms must be more diverse and agroecological to ensure a more diversified nutrient output. So he argues that just in order for people to get the right nutrients, we have to return to a more diversified farming system and a more agroecological one. We also have, you would think this would be part of farm policy, but it barely is. Our farm subsidies must be coupled with agroecological principles. In other words, requiring farms to follow good agroecological principles in order to get subsidies. That's just so obvious, and yet it's not being done right now. We should adopt laws that ban some of the worst practices, such as Proposition 2 in California did with the sow craze. Those are absolutely justified and I think needed on the national level. We must enforce existing laws. The main problem, I worked as an environmental lawyer for several years, specifically focusing on the pollution from agriculture, and the most shocking thing to me was that the law was being completely unenforced all over the country. And we simply just need to enforce the Clean Water and Clean Air Act. And additionally, the government, I think, should be proactively involved in fostering regional food systems. It was mentioned a couple of times today that there's a real shortage of good regional slaughterhouses and access to them by smaller independent farms. It's essential, I believe, that the government help make those things come about. And I should note, part of the reason I believe that is because the government's lax enforcement of some of the anti-competition laws, et cetera, is what has allowed the situation to come about today. So people that are opposed to government intervention need to see it, I think, in that greater picture. Additionally, the government is a huge food purchaser. It buys a lot of food for VA hospitals, for obviously for government employees, is involved in school food purchasing, et cetera, for the military, et cetera. If the government would set food purchasing policies, that would have a dramatic impact on the way we farmed in this country and the way we ate. Now, that's what I think some of the things the government needs to do. What about individual action? And I think that is equally important. First of all of us are citizens. I think we need to demand from our local, state, and federal representatives that they, in fact, take an interest in the food issue and the farming issue, and that they do some of the things that we're trying to get improved in our community, such as the creation of regional slaughterhouses, get involved in those kinds of issues and issues related to farmers markets, et cetera. But we also have laws like the antibiotics law that's been pending in Congress and has been reintroduced every year for 10 years in a row and has not yet passed. The European Union outlawed the continual feeding of antibiotics many years ago. We need to do the same thing in the United States today. And we need to tell our representatives that we expect them to vote for that law. As consumers, each of us has a role in terms of what we buy and the things that we pick every day. We have an opportunity through our voting, through every time that we eat and every time we buy food, to vote for the kinds of food system that we believe in. I believe that better eating means more fruits and vegetables, as I suggested earlier, far, far less sweeteners than most of us are, and I include all of the artificial sweeteners and the other natural sweeteners that are not sugar, by the way. I think they're generally pretty equal in terms of health consequences. Less grain, substantially less grain than we're consuming and than we're currently subsidizing, and less and better animal products. There's a huge amount of evidence showing that not only are there tremendous environmental benefits to grass-based animal agriculture, but there are great human health benefits to grass-based animal agriculture as well. And there are just a few quick pictures of some of the, I don't know why they're not coming up very well here, some of the farms that we work with around the country that are involved in kind of agriculture. This is a sow, by the way, building a nest. She is not eating that grass, she's bringing the grass, she's gathering it, and she's just about to have some piglets, and she wants to lie down in that grass. And this is a pasture-raised chicken operation in upstate New York, a dairy operation which is totally grass-based in Wisconsin, and a few pictures of our own ranch. That's my husband Bill, who founded the company Niman Ranch, some of you may be familiar with. There's me working on the ranch. I have to show at least one picture to prove that I do that. And I have some credentials. My favorite cow girlfriend, any of you who have read my book know all about her. She's still there and doing great. These are our heritage turkeys that we raise. We raise totally grass-fed beef and heritage turkeys. I didn't mention that earlier, but that's what we do on our ranch in Bolinas. This is my son Miles, and I always say, you don't need to have children to care about what happens to the planet or to care about what happens to the next generation, but for me at least, it was certainly something that made me care even more. And I feel that what we're doing is we're fighting for a better food system, a healthier food system, and trying to create a food system that is something we can all be proud of and will feed this generation and the next in a healthful way. Thank you.